Rome. End of the 2nd decade BC. Frost crunches on the stones of the road leading north to the Alps. Tens of thousands of legionaries march through the white silence, their metal sandals clanking on the ice like chains. The cold pierces to the bone, skin cracks, breath turns into steam, as if the soul is leaving the mouth. But why couldn't the warriors of the great empire, which had subjugated half the world, protect themselves from frostbite? Why couldn't Rome, which had created roads, aqueducts, and siege engines, invent simple winter footwear for so long? Historians write that during the time of Julius Caesar and later during the Germanic campaigns, thousands of soldiers suffered not from swords but from the cold. Tacitus mentioned how the north wind tore down tents and killed guards overnight who hadn't managed to light a fire. Archaeological findings in Germany show charred fire pits were found in the camps, but almost no pair of footwear adapted for snow. Legionaries wore open leather sandals, caligae, convenient for marching on the roads of Italy, but deadly in snow. Then an almost forgotten item enters the stage of Roman history: leather winter boots that saved lives. They were called compaghi. These were sturdy boots made of thick leather with a soft sheepskin lining, fastened with straps up to mid-calf. They became a rare exception, a luxury accessible to officers or legionaries on distant northern frontiers. Imagine this image: a dark night, snow up to one's face, a legionary on guard, under a cloak of coarse wool, under chainmail, only thin leather straps, and these boots. Compaghi were not a fashion, they were salvation. One false step on the crusted snow, wet leather, and within an hour the man could no longer stand. Soldiers warmed their feet in the ashes of bonfires, dried their footwear on spears, and at dawn walked on the ice again. The term compaghi originated from the Latin word campus, field, camp. And in this name lay the essence: footwear not for the city, but for field conditions, for campaigns where life depended on how firmly you stood on your feet. These boots became a symbol of endurance, just as the gladius was a symbol of strength. But the Roman army did not immediately adopt the innovation. Many old centurions considered compaghi a sign of weakness. According to them, a true warrior should be hardened by wind and snow. However, the harsh reality of the northern campaigns quickly showed. Without this footwear, legions melted away faster than their enemies could strike. In the cold lands of Gaul and Germania, every step turned into an ordeal. Blood in their veins thickened from the frost, breath cut their lungs. And it was then that compaghi began to change the fate of the army, quietly, without triumphs, without manifestos. A soldier who hadn't lost his toes could continue the fight. And if armor saved the body and the sword honor, then these leather boots saved the very existence of the Roman legion. But the path to their recognition was long, and cost the empire many frozen feet, frostbitten bodies, and lost victories. The cold, against which there was no shield, proved stronger than any enemy. And to defeat it, the Romans had to change the very philosophy of war, from proud endurance to sensible survival. It is from this moment that the history of winter footwear begins, which transformed into a weapon no less significant than a sword. For in harsh northern campaigns, winter didn't just slow the pace, it decided who would make it to spring. And those who didn't believe in the power of leather and fur would soon learn the price of pride, literally, on their own feet. Snow settled on helmets like gray hair on the heads of old men. Legions moved north to where even sounds froze in the air. The year was 41 AD. Emperor Claudius was preparing the army for a campaign into Britain. Tens of thousands of soldiers, centurions, slaves, mules, and blacksmiths crossed the Gallic plains, where temperatures dropped below zero. The march lasted for weeks, and by the time the troops reached the coast, exhausted people hobbled on bleeding feet. It was then that Roman quartermasters began to massively supply soldiers with new footwear, campaghi. This footwear became Rome's first attempt to adapt the army to the climate, and not vice versa. Campaghi were made from oxhide, coarse but durable, and had a sheepskin lining. The edges of the boot rose to the calf, secured by straps. For additional insulation, warriors inserted dry leaves or grease-soaked fabric inside. Iron spikes were sometimes hammered into the sole to prevent slipping on ice. Tacitus wrote that legions without winter clothing lost more men to the cold than to swords. And when archaeologists found charred fire pits in Germanic camps, they discovered metal buckles next to them, the only thing left of the campaghi. Each buckle was a mark of survival. Where they lay, someone had once survived the night, preserving their feet. The boots were expensive. A single pair cost the equivalent of 2 rations of grain, too much for a common soldier. Therefore, campaghi were initially worn only by centurions and legates, commanders for whom the cold could mean losing control of the legion. The Roman army was a machine of discipline. An officer had no right to catch a cold. If he could not stand on his feet, the entire chain of command collapsed. Legionaries, however, were forced to find their own ways of salvation. They wrapped their feet in rags soaked in animal fat, placed pieces of wool under their heels, and sometimes took footwear from slain enemies to avoid freezing. In one of the letters found at Vindolanda Fort in northern Britain, an unknown soldier asked for a pair of warm socks and thicker sandals to be sent. This is living proof. Even decades after the invasion, the Romans were still learning to survive the northern winter. It was then that the term insulae campagines, insulated campaghi, entered army usage. This was the name for improved boots where felt or fur was inserted between layers of leather. A simple, almost intuitive invention, yet it changed marching tactics. From this moment on, legions could move not only in summer, but also in winter. The image of those campaigns was like a march on the edge of cold. Soldiers walked through snow that crunched like sand in the Colosseum arena. Every breath cut their chests. Every stop turned into a struggle for warmth. Their steps resembled the beats of the empire's heart, slow, heavy, but unstoppable. Yet this victory over nature came at a high cost. Quartermasters had to transport hundreds of bales of leather, fur, and oil. Horses bogged down in the snow, wagons broke, and footwear supplies quickly ran out. Warriors repaired their boots right in the camp. They cut new soles from shields, stitched straps with sinews, and greased them to prevent cracking. Historians differ on when exactly campaghi became an official part of legionary equipment. Some believe it happened under Trajan during his Dacian campaigns. Others, that it was already under Augustus on the northern borders of the Rhine. But all sources agree on one thing. Without this footwear, no campaign to the north would have been possible. It was in the cold lands of Germania, where rivers froze over and armor clanged from the frost, that a new symbol of Roman discipline was born. A soldier who does not surrender to the cold. Campaghi became an extension of his body. In them he slept, marched, fought. They smelled of smoke, sweat, and leather, the scent of survival. Thus the Roman army learned to wage war against nature itself, not with a sword, not with fire, but with a strap and a seam. And in this quiet victory over the cold lay a great truth. The empire endures not only on blood and iron, but also on the ability to warm a person at the moment when the world around turns into an icy desert. Winter in the northern provinces did not forgive mistakes. When the legions crossed the Alps or camped in Upper Germany, snow became not just an element, it transformed into an enemy. On such days, the cold was like an invisible army. It didn't attack, it simply waited. And if armor protected against arrows, frost crept in where no shields existed, under the skin. The chronicles mentioned how at dawn Romans found sentries frozen at their posts, still standing with spears in hand, as if alive. It was then that the significance of Campaggi became obvious even to the most stubborn veterans. The warriors called them second feet. The boots, made of thick oxhide, absorbed moisture but still retained warmth. Their soles were layered, stitched with linen thread saturated with resin to prevent rot. Outside, straps. Inside, sheepskin, which was rubbed with fat. Even the smell of these boots was distinct, a mixture of smoke, sweat, and fat. It permeated the skin, like a memory of cold nights by the campfire. A centurion was allowed to have a spare pair of Campaggi. For an ordinary legionary, such a luxury was unattainable. Their boots wore out within a few weeks. In Roman camps, there were special workshops, factories where slaves and captured Celts repaired footwear. It was a true shoe army within the army. Every soldier knew losing Campaggi on a winter campaign was equivalent to losing one's life. Roman logistics operated with impeccable precision. Caravans with leather, fur, and tools were sent from Italy to the northern provinces. One cart could carry up to 500 pairs of boots, but even such a flow was not always enough to replenish the wear and tear. Then the legates gave the order, "Remove footwear from the fallen." It sounded cruel, but there was no other way. In the cold land, the value of a boot was equated to the value of a sword. In archaeological excavations of Vindolanda Fort in northern Britain, hundreds of soles, eroded by time, were found. Among them were children's sizes. This meant that legionaries' families lived in the camps, and even they needed protection from the cold. Small Campaggi for children, a silent trace of how the empire tried to warm itself entirely, not just with a sword, but with fur-lined leather. A fact often overlooked by historians, boots changed the army's movement tactics. Before the advent of Campaggi, legions ceased active operations with the onset of winter, withdrawing to garrisons. But when the footwear allowed soldiers to move through snow, winter raids began, sudden, deadly swift. This was a new type of warfare. Frost, which had previously been an enemy, became an ally. Barbarians accustomed to warm dwellings were now caught off guard amidst blizzards. The term hiberna, winter quarters, became key in the Roman military system. This was the name given to camps where legions spent the winter without disbanding the army. In them, stone walls were built, baths and forges were erected where footwear was repaired. But even there, the cold did not recede. Campaggi hung at entrances, dried by hearths, and every warrior knew if the boots did not dry by morning, feet would be lost. The image of wintering was not silence, but the eternal crunch of snow, the smoke of bonfires, and the clang of hammers. Warriors sewed, greased, patched. Sometimes, when the temperature dropped too low, they put on 2 pairs of woolen foot wraps, and their feet became like stones wrapped in fabric. And in the distance, beyond the palisade, the enemy waited, the Germans, watching from the forest as Rome tried to warm itself. A centurion, walking along the ranks, looked not only at weapons, he checked footwear. A soldier with a cracked sole risked dying before battle. This was a new code of survival. Discipline was measured not by the length of a spear, but by the sturdiness of a boot. One modern historian noted, Rome defeated the barbarians not with a sword, but with a strap. And in these words there is no exaggeration. Campaggi became the empire's first winter strategy. Where barbarians lived by fire, Romans walked through snow, raising standards covered in frost. But this new strength came at a price. Leather, soaked in grease, quickly rotted, causing foot diseases. Soldiers rubbed their feet with salt, bandaged them with rags to prevent festering sores. In winter, the smell of a legionary camp was a mixture of smoke, metal, and human pain. But no one complained, because where even stones cracked from the cold, it was the leather of the Campaggi that became the boundary between life and death. and the further the empire moved north, the thinner this boundary became. The cold turned into an examination that not everyone could pass. But as long as the boots held, so did the empire. When the wind tore down tents and howled through armor, the Roman camp turned into a living reminder that man is weak before nature. The cold did not scream, did not attack, it simply slowly took away strength. It was under such conditions that Emperor Trajan's campaign against the Dacians, which began in 101 AD, became a test not only for weaponry, but also for the very ability to survive. Winter in the Carpathians killed silently, and salvation once again came from Campagi, those very leather boots that were now spoken of not as a luxury, but as a military tool. Legions moved through passes where even horses could not withstand the frost. Temperatures dropped below -10 by modern standards. The cold penetrated under chainmail, under tunics, under the skin. The Romans called this time the season without sound. Steps on the snow became muffled, voices drowned in the mist of breath. And amidst this silence, only one sound was constant, the crunch of leather boots freezing with each step. It was then that the legates first introduced a mandatory rule: to inspect footwear before leaving camp. Campagi became part of the formation inspection alongside the sword and helmet. A boot, torn or soaked, was considered a threat to discipline, because a soldier without footwear is not a warrior. He is a burden to his comrades. In one of the inscriptions found on a stone in the Romanian mountains, Fabricum Campaginum is mentioned, craftsmen who repaired boots for the army. They received extra rations and exemption from guard duty. Without them, the army literally could not stand on its feet. Tacitus wrote that warriors who lost their footwear walked barefoot through the snow until they found a fallen comrade and removed the boots from him. This grim practice became a silent symbol of how cold equalizes everyone: the legate and the common soldier, the hero and the nameless recruit. Campagi, like all Roman engineering, evolved. By the mid-2nd century, models with double soles appeared, 2 layers of leather, between which wool was placed. Such boots retained heat twice as long, and soldiers could stand on guard for hours. They were called Campagi doublets. The soles were fastened with copper nails, which left patterned tracks in the snow. Archaeologists later used these to determine the legion's route. The image of these tracks is striking. Thousands of identical imprints receding into the white distance. No names, no faces, only the boot prints pressed into the ice. These are the traces of an empire that marched on despite everything. At the same time, a new military term appeared, calcius militaris. This was the name given to improved campagi for officers. They were adorned with metal buckles, sometimes with an engraved legionary symbol. But their function remained the same, to protect from the cold. Even Emperor Trajan, it is said, wore similar boots during marches. On the bas-reliefs of Trajan's column in Rome, one can see soldiers in long cloaks and closed footwear assaulting Dacian fortifications amidst the snow. This is the first depiction of army winter equipment in history. However, cold was not the only enemy. Moisture, soaking into the leather, made the boots heavy. One legionary wrote in a letter, "After a day's march, my feet feel like they are carrying 2 stones." But no one complained, because a boot, no matter how uncomfortable, meant life. The warriors rubbed the leather with grease, wrapped their feet in wool, and when the boots got wet, they placed them by the fire until the leather blackened from smoke. The Romans quickly understood. Winter warfare required new rules. Camps were now built closer to sources of fresh water, where leather could be softened and footwear could be sewn and patched. Barrels of tanning solutions appeared in arsenals, and craftsmen were trained with the legions. Campagi became not just an item, but a part of the supply strategy. Without them, it was impossible either to cross a river or hold a fortress. The philosopher Seneca wrote that courage is not to endure the cold, but to conquer it with reason. These words perhaps were addressed precisely to those warriors who marched through the snow-covered mountains of Dacia. They did not challenge the elements, they learned to live with them. Kempagi became a symbol of this new understanding of strength, the strength not to resist, but to adapt. And yet, every morning, when the sun barely rose over the mountains, the legionaries would again emerge from their tents, putting on their heavy boots. The cold awaited them beyond the first step, but now they knew, between death and life, there were merely a few layers of leather. And these layers, smelling of smoke and sweat, were stronger than the marble walls of Rome. When winter became endless, even the campfire's flame seemed tired. On such nights, Roman legions resembled not an army, but a moving tribe of survivors. Fog over the valleys of Dacia hid the land, and frost crunched under their boots, as if the very air protested against the invasion. During these months, the cold became Rome's true adversary, and, paradoxically, it was the footwear that determined who would emerge from this battle alive. Kempagi were now worn by everyone, from legionary to tribune. They became an unofficial symbol of the northern campaigns. Every soldier knew. To lose a boot meant to lose footing, balance, and with it, life. The leather soaked in grease became soft, almost alive. Soldiers said their footwear breathed like a comrade's chest. With every step it creaked and exhaled steam. In the German lands, archaeologists found fragments of footwear with remnants of fur burned from a campfire. This meant that legionaries dried their boots directly by the flame, risking damage to the leather. But there was no other way. Overnight, the boots would freeze solid, and in the morning they had to be broken open with fists to be put on. One of the letters found from Vindolanda describes how a soldier, waking up after the cold, went out to his post barefoot because his footwear had turned to iron. These details seem minor, but it was precisely they who decided the fates of armies. Kempagi made possible what previously seemed madness: winter offensives. Legionaries began to move across frozen rivers, where the ice served as a bridge, not an obstacle. This was a new type of warfare, where snow ceased to be an enemy. The barbarians, who believed that the Romans would leave with the first frosts, were mistaken. Now the empire could wage war 12 months a year. Tactical reports from Trajan's time show, with the introduction of winter equipment, march speed increased by almost a third. Soldiers covered up to 20 kilometers a day, even in snow. For comparison, this is the distance from a modern city to a neighboring valley, every day, week after week, in sub-zero temperatures. Kempagi became not just protection. They allowed the army to move and, therefore, to exist. The term vexillation denoted a detachment separated from a legion for a specific assignment. It was precisely such detachments that most often went on winter reconnaissance raids, and in their equipment, Kempagi became as important as a sword or armor. Without them, a soldier could not make his way through an icy stream, could not stand in ambush, could not escape if the enemy attacked suddenly. Archaeological excavations show the footwear of those years was remarkably well designed. Soles were reinforced with copper spikes to prevent slipping, and the edges of the boots were padded with additional layers of leather. Inside, sheep's wool. Outside, a thick layer of lard grease. Each boot was made by hand. An entire artel of slaves and craftsmen could work in one camp. They toiled day and night, and the smell of tanned leather hung over the camp, mixing with smoke and iron. On such evenings, legionaries gathered by the fire. Some warmed their boots, some greased the soles, some simply watched in silence as sparks flew into the dark sky. The cold united them. There were no distinctions in rank, no Roman pride, only a common desire to survive until morning. Kempagi became a personal amulet. When someone died, their boots were passed to a comrade, not as an item, but as a part of their will. Historians note, the Romans' endurance astonished even their enemies. Barbarians recounted seeing legions march through snow for weeks without lighting fires so as not to reveal themselves. Soldiers slept in their boots to avoid losing warmth. In the morning, they simply got up and continued marching. These were not people. These were steps, transformed into a ritual. Yet the cold did not surrender. Foot diseases decimated legions like swords. Chronicles mention cases where entire cohorts were put out of action due to frostbite. But the army learned, greasing leather, drying footwear, bandaging feet. Campaggi did not make a soldier invulnerable, but they gave him a chance, and in winter warfare, a chance is already a victory. Thus, Rome gradually conquered not only people, but also the elements. The empire learned not to conquer nature, but to survive within it. And perhaps precisely in this lay its true strength, not in conquests, but in the ability to keep going when any other people would have stopped. For winter tested not the army, but its spirit, and those who could warm their feet could also warm the empire. In spring, the snow finally began to recede. The earth slowly freed itself from its icy shackles, and with the first drops of meltwater, the smell of leather, smoke, and char spread through the camp. The Campaggi, blackened from winter, lay by the campfires. They were cleaned, mended, and dried. Soldiers, accustomed to the cold, now felt a strange lightness. Their feet no longer ached. Their step became softer. The earth felt warmer. But with the warmth also came the realization. Those who had survived the winter were no longer the same. They bore the traces of the cold, not only on their bodies but also in their memories. On the soles of their boots remained embedded spikes, worn edges, traces of salt and blood. Each imprint spoke of a path traversed through snow and death. The Campaggi became a chronicle without words. And if Rome had roads along which history marched, then the legionaries had boots in which that history was written. Spring marches proceeded faster. The ground yielded. The air began to smell of damp grass. But discipline did not vanish. Before each deployment, centurions once again checked their footwear, not their swords, not their shields, but precisely their boots, because now even commanders knew. An army falls not from an enemy's sword, but from the cold that creeps up from below, from the ground. Emperor Trajan, upon receiving news of victory in Dacia, ordered the legion's shoemakers to be awarded silver rings, a rare instance where honor went to those who did not wield weapons. Their labor saved thousands of lives. And in this decision, a new understanding of war was perceived. Victory was not just strategy, but also attention to detail. The Campaggi outlasted their wars. When the legions returned to Rome, the boots were taken off and hung in the barracks. But the leather, dried and soaked with sweat, still retained the scent of winter, the scent of survival. For those who had endured the snow, it was not merely an item of equipment, but a reminder. The empire's strength begins with a simple step taken in the frost.